"Who is this old man who dares to sit here?" a young officer sneered with a mocking laugh, pointing straight at Harold Bennett, the elderly veteran in an old wheelchair. No medals, no records, probably just leftover junk from the system. The entire SEAL briefing room buzzed with murmurs, scornful eyes converging on the silent man. In front of the cameras, the humiliation unfolded stark and bare. Then the SEAL Admiral turned and asked a question that seemed harmless, yet carried a deeply buried history. "What is your call sign?" But just a few seconds later, one single moment, everything reversed. Harold Bennett lifted his head, his voice low and resolute. "Shadow 1. The room froze. No laughter. No one dared to breathe loudly, because that was not an ordinary call sign. It was a name once erased from classified records, tied to missions so sensitive that, if they failed, the government would deny everything. A legend forced into silence. If you were humiliated in front of a crowd, stripped of all credit and identity, would you choose to stand up or bow your head before those who abuse their power? Comment with your answer, and follow and subscribe to the channel now, because this story will make you rethink the very concept of Anahero from the beginning. On an afternoon in December of the year 2025, the small conference room of the VA Veterans Hospital in San Diego was filled with carefully calculated light. The late-day sun filtered through the glass windows, warm enough to soften the atmosphere, yet pale enough not to disrupt the visual composition already arranged by the filming crew. This was the annual tribute ceremony of the United States Navy. In this familiar ritual, past and present were deliberately placed side by side, where everything had to appear proper, dignified, and memorable on screen. The cameras had been positioned at fixed angles. The lighting was gentle, not too harsh, casting no hard shadows. The backdrop was neat, with the Navy insignia behind it, enough for anyone at a glance to recognize that this was an official moment, one meant to be recorded and archived. The host stood near the technical table, lowering his voice when he saw the signal indicating readiness to broadcast. "We are live." The short sentence was enough to remind everyone that every movement, every expression in this room would be preserved. The door opened at precisely the right moment. Admiral James Harlan stepped in, leading a group of SEAL officers. He walked slowly, posture straight, his gaze accustomed to surveying an entire room in a single sweep. His footsteps made little sound, but his presence alone was enough to alter the atmosphere. Harlan was the type of man who carried a sense of order with him. He did not need to speak much to command attention. His composure and the authority accumulated over the years compelled others to adjust their demeanor the moment he appeared. Harlan paused briefly at the doorway, as if by habit, then moved inside. The lights reflected off the rows of medals on his chest, creating cold points of brightness. No one in the room needed an introduction to him. To many, Harlan was a symbol of continuity, a man who believed that the strength of the Navy did not lie solely in the newest technology, but also in memories passed from one generation to the next. The veterans had arrived early. They sat upright in neatly aligned rows of chairs, the backs parallel, spaced just far enough apart for the cameras to capture a complete frame. Their eyes were directed toward the entrance where Harlan had just walked in, carrying with them a quiet sense of anticipation. For many of them, this moment was not about being praised, but about being seen, about knowing that their past years still held meaning in the present. Walking beside Harlan was Major Derek Vance, significantly younger than most of the people in the room. Vance moved with sharp confidence. His eyes swept quickly across the rows of seats, never lingering on any face for long. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, just enough to reveal the thoughts behind his composed exterior. He tilted his head and lowered his voice to an accompanying officer. "A living museum." The words were spoken softly, audible only to those nearby, yet their meaning was unmistakable. Vance continued, his tone carrying undisguised sarcasm. "War now is artificial intelligence, drones, and satellites, not these dusty stories." The young officer beside him let out a chuckle, the sound quickly dissolving into the air. No one corrected them. No one appeared offended. In that moment, the reverence arranged within the room revealed a small crack, subtle, yet visible to a discerning eye. Harlan did not turn around. He continued forward, beginning his familiar ritual. He stopped before each veteran, extended his hand, called them by the correct name, recalled the correct campaign, the correct years. Each handshake was firm, unhurried, never perfunctory. For Harlan, this was not a performance for the cameras, but a way of affirming that memory was still being preserved. The cameras followed every movement closely. The lighting shifted slightly to capture the expressions on the faces of those being addressed. Aged faces, eyes that had witnessed far more than they had ever spoken of. Within that frame, everything seemed to be in its proper place. There was only one corner of the room that was different. At the end of the row, near the wall where the light did not reach, an old, worn wheelchair sat apart. It was neither pushed aside nor deliberately set apart, but its position was enough to keep the person seated there out of the camera's natural line of sight. The man sitting in it did not resemble the other veterans. He carried none of the familiar signs of recognition. There was no expectant gaze waiting to be called, no composed posture facing forward. The lights did not reach him. This was not due to any intentional adjustment, but because the original layout had never accounted for the presence of someone like him. In a space filled with symbols of honor and ritual, he resembled an overlooked detail, a space that had never been filled. Vance glanced toward that corner once more. His gaze lingered for a brief moment longer, then moved away quickly, as if it were not worth the attention. To him, this ceremony was a procedure, a familiar stage where the present asserted its position over the past. Anything that did not fit that picture was merely noise. Harlan continued toward the back of the room, but his gaze slowed when he sensed the difference. He said nothing, only observed. The cameras began a slow pan, following the visual script that had been carefully prepared. The lens drifted away from the familiar faces and gradually toward the dimmest part of the room. The frame settled on the old wheelchair. The dark-skinned man seated there remained silent. He did not lift his head, did not seek anyone's eyes. In that moment, the perfection of the tribute suddenly felt fragile. A small crack had appeared, right in the center of a meticulously calculated frame, signaling that the story unfolding in this room would not end with what had been arranged in advance. Harold Bennett sat motionless in his old wheelchair, its two tires worn thin, revealing scratches that had been carved deeply by the passage of years. His position was pressed against the wall, where the light from the overhead fixtures could not reach, as if from the very beginning, this room had never been designed to acknowledge his presence. While the front rows were filled with greetings, handshakes, and eyes waiting to hear their names called, Bennett became a silent part of the backdrop, present yet unseen. He lowered his head, his gaze resting on the VA medical folder placed neatly on his lap. The paper cover was creased, the corners frayed, and the pages inside surely opened and closed countless times over the years. It was not something people usually brought to a ceremony of appreciation, but for Bennett, it was inseparable from his current life, more real than any words of thanks or medals pinned to other men's chests. His thin hand slowly turned an old silver coin. The edge was worn smooth, the surface lightly scratched, the metallic sheen no longer bright under the weak lights. The coin fit perfectly in his palm, so familiar that he did not need to look to know it was there. It was an unconscious habit, a small movement to keep his mind from drifting to places he had spent a lifetime trying to avoid. From the front row, Derek Vance caught sight of that image. His eyes paused for a moment, his eyebrows lifting slightly. He tilted his head, his voice low but loud enough for those nearby to hear. Did he wander into the wrong place? The question was spoken with feigned curiosity, but beneath it lay contempt that required no concealment. A young officer sitting nearby glanced in the direction Vance indicated, then turned back and lowered his voice. An actual veteran. The question carried doubt, as if Bennett's worn appearance and silence alone were enough to deny every other possibility. Vance gave a short, sharp laugh. If he were a hero, he wouldn't be sitting in that corner. He spoke as if stating an obvious truth, an unwritten rule he believed unquestionable. In Vance's world, seating reflected worth, light reflected importance, and anything outside the main frame was merely excess detail. Bennett heard them. His hearing was still sharp enough not to miss those whispers, but he did not lift his head. His gaze remained on the medical folder. His hand maintained the slow rhythm of turning the coin. He had heard remarks like that for many years, in hospital corridors, in crowded waiting rooms, in moments when he had to explain his past to people who had never once asked about his feelings. His silence was not a momentary reaction, but a choice repeated so many times it had become instinct. The sounds in the room continued, steady and familiar. Handshakes, names being called, brief but proper words of praise. Each time Harlan stopped before a veteran, the air seemed to pause for a beat, then quickly warmed again with stories retold. Eyes lit up, fleeting smiles appeared, all forming a continuous current of recognition. That current did not reach where Bennett sat. The space around him grew thicker, as if an invisible wall separated him from the rest of the room. No one turned to ask after him. No one was curious. The silence surrounding him was not respect, but forgetfulness carried out so naturally that it required no intent. Vance continued to follow the ceremony with indifference. To him, these rituals were part of the job, necessary to maintain an image, but devoid of personal meaning. His gaze occasionally swept over Bennett, each time carrying the same cold assessment: someone who did not fit, a minor flaw in a carefully constructed picture. Harlan was different. As he moved toward the back of the room, his pace slowed. He was accustomed to reading a room, accustomed to noticing details others overlooked. His eyes passed over familiar faces, then stopped at a point that had not been part of his original expectations. The old wheelchair was pressed against the wall. The dark-skinned man was sitting quietly. No medals, no name placard, no expectant gaze waiting to be called. Harlan did not approach immediately. He simply stood there for a beat, observing. In that moment, the image of a flawless appreciation ceremony the room was striving to maintain gained a slight ripple. The cameras continued recording, but the lenses were not yet aimed at Bennett. The visual script did not call for it. Still, Harlan's attention created a subtle shift in the atmosphere. A few officers noticed his gaze, turned their heads instinctively, then quickly looked away when they could not understand what was happening. Bennett sensed that shift. Even without looking up, he was used to recognizing when attention was about to fall on him, not through sight, but through changes in sound and the breathing around him. His hand stopped turning the coin for a second, then resumed, more slowly. Harlan took another step toward the last row. His eyes did not leave the forgotten man. In his mind, questions began to form, not hurried, not loud, but clear enough to be impossible to ignore. Who was this man? Why was he here? And why had no one else noticed? At the front, Vance was still engaged in conversation with another officer, his voice low and confident. He did not realize that the presence he dismissed was beginning to draw the attention of the only person in the room with enough authority to alter the carefully arranged order. Harlan stopped. The distance between him and Bennett was now only a few steps. The lights still did not reach the corner, but attention had arrived. A brief moment passed, long enough for the perceptive to realize that this ceremony was about to turn in another direction. No longer fully contained within the planned framework, Bennett remained seated, his gaze still fixed on the medical folder on his lap. He did not know what was coming, but he had lived long enough to understand that when silence lasted too long, it often ended with a question, and that question, no matter how gently spoken, could change everything. James Harlan moved along the row of seats with a steady pace, each pause carrying absolute focus. He shook hands with every veteran, called each one by the correct name, and recalled campaigns that had faded many decades into the past. His voice was low and clear, enough for the person before him to feel genuine respect, not the kind of words meant for the camera. The room followed his rhythm, falling silent, and then softly murmuring again, like a ritual that had been repeated for many years. When Harlan reached the final row of seats, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The whispers grew quieter. A few young officers watched with curiosity as the Admiral stopped at a position that was not meant to be the focal point of the ceremony. The old wheelchair against the wall came more clearly into everyone's view. Harlan stood in front of Harold Bennett. He looked at the elderly man for a brief moment, long enough to notice the difference. There was no nameplate, no medals, only a quiet posture and a gaze that had never sought attention. Harlan smiled, the familiar smile of someone accustomed to beginning conversations with respect. "Thank you for your service." Bennett lifted his head. His eyes met Harlan's for a brief instant. He gave a slight nod, like a reflex preserved over many years. He was about to say something, perhaps just a simple courtesy. But before the words could leave his mouth, another voice cut in. "Sir, this man probably did paperwork." Derek Vance stepped half a pace forward, his voice loud enough for even those standing far away to hear. The way he spoke was neither rushed nor harsh, but carried the confidence of someone who believed he was standing on the right side. A few eyes turned toward Vance. A few people held their breath. The rest remained silent, as if waiting to see Harlan's reaction. Vance did not stop. He raised his hand and pointed toward Bennett's chest, the gesture neat and decisive. Not a single medal in sight. The sentence dropped into the room like a heavy object. A few young officers laughed, short and hurried laughs, then quickly fell silent when they noticed the looks from those around them. But it had already sounded enough to shatter the carefully constructed solemnity. Harlan frowned. The change on his face was not dramatic, but it was clear. He turned toward Vance, his voice dropping lower. "Major Vance." Just 2 words, but enough to remind him of the boundary he had just crossed. Vance shrugged, his expression calm, as if there were nothing to apologize for, just stating the truth. "Sir," he replied, his eyes never leaving Bennett. In that voice, there was no open challenge, but there was the stubbornness of someone who believed his version of the truth was the only one. Bennett stood between the two men, becoming the center of a conversation he had never initiated. He said nothing. The hand resting on his thigh tightened slightly. The silver coin in his palm turned halfway and then stopped completely. No one noticed the small movement, but for Bennett, it was enough to keep him from being swept away by the rising emotions. In his mind, familiar sounds echoed, not from this room, but from the years before. Hasty judgments, passing glances. He had learned to let such things pass without leaving a mark. But this time was different. This time, the contempt was spoken aloud in front of people he had once stood beside, in a room built to honor history. Harlan remained silent for a moment. He looked at Bennett, then at Vance. The cameras were still recording, the lights still evenly shining, but the atmosphere had drifted from its original course. A few veterans in the front began to turn around, realizing that something was going wrong. "We are here to honor history," Harlan said, his voice slow and clear. He did not raise his tone, nor did he need to emphasize it. Everyone has their own story. The words were directed at Vance, but his gaze returned to Bennett, like a quiet acknowledgement. Vance did not respond immediately. He stepped back half a pace, but the faint smile remained on his lips. To him, words like that were part of the ceremony, changing nothing about the essence of the matter. He believed that anything not proven by visible symbols was not worthy of respect. Bennett took a deep breath. He clearly felt his heartbeat, steady but heavy. The coin in his hand turned lightly again, the metal touching his skin and creating a familiar cold sensation. He did not lift his head again. He was used to letting others speak for him, used to letting real stories be drowned out by surface judgments. In that room, the silence began to stretch. There was no more laughter, no more murmured greetings, only Harlan's gaze, Vance's indifference, and Bennett's quiet posture remained. 3 points forming a tense triangle, enough for the entire room to feel it. If you were in this room, what would you do? Would you remain silent like most of those standing there? Or would you speak up when contempt is expressed publicly? Follow this story to see what price that seemingly small moment will have to pay. Harlan turned back to face Bennett, his voice lowered, carrying a seriousness completely different from before. "Where did you serve?" Harlan's question hung in the air long enough for every gaze in the room to converge on the man sitting in the wheelchair near the wall. Harold Bennett felt that attention wasoti through sight, but through a subtle shift in the surrounding sound. The murmurs died away completely. The space grew so still that he could clearly hear his own breathing. He lifted his head. His eyes met Harlan's calm and direct. Bennett did not need time to think, nor did he try to make his answer sound more impressive. He had lived long enough to understand that whatever he said now would not change how others saw him, at least not immediately. "Submarines, sir." During the Cold War, his voice was low, slightly raspy with age, but clear. A wave of murmuring rippled through the room. The veterans seated in front turned around. A few frowned, as if trying to place that answer into a familiar context. To them, submarines were symbols of silence, of missions rarely spoken about. To the younger people, it was a foreign world, far beyond their imagination of modern warfare. Derek Vance laughed before anyone else could react. His laughter rang out clearly, cutting through the atmosphere that was struggling to maintain its seriousness. Sitting underwater listening to the radio, he said, his tone mixing feigned astonishment with open mockery. A few glances turned toward him, but Vance did not care. He shook his head as if he had just heard something absurd, and that's called fighting. The question was not asked to seek an answer. It was a judgment, a way of framing Bennett's past as something trivial and outdated. Harlan turned toward Vance. His voice grew cold, sharper than before. "That's enough." The 2 words were spoken, slowly, carrying the weight of rank and experience. The room held its breath. A few young officers lowered their heads, avoiding the Admiral's gaze. Vance fell silent for a moment. He did not respond, but his expression showed no remorse. He stepped back half a pace, folded his arms across his chest, his eyes still fixed on Bennett. To Vance, being corrected in front of everyone was an irritation, but not enough to change his perspective. Bennett did not react. He did not lower his head, nor did he turn away. His gaze remained steady, avoiding everyone's eyes. His calm did not come from an inability to feel the mockery, but from having learned to let such words pass without shaking what he knew to be true. Harlan turned back to face Bennett. He studied the man before him for another beat. The answer Bennett had given carried no details meant to impress, yet it was precisely that brevity that caught Harlan's attention. He had met many people who spoke more than necessary, especially in front of superiors. Bennett was different. He said only what needed to be said. "Did you ever work with the SEALs?" Harlan asked next, lowering his voice as if to separate this question from the mockery that had just occurred. The room fell silent again. This question carried a different meaning. It was no longer casual curiosity, but a deeper step into Bennett's past. Vance raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting this direction. A few veterans in front exchanged glances, as if guessing where the answer might lead. Bennett hesitated. This was the first time in the conversation that he paused, not because he did not know the answer, but because he knew exactly what that answer could bring with it. His hand tightened slightly, the silver coin in his palm turning slowly through one full rotation. The cold metal pressed against his skin, reminding him of decisions made under conditions no one in this room could fully imagine. "Yes," he said, then paused for a brief beat. A few times, the final two words were spoken more softly, as if he were trying to lessen their weight, but in that room, they were anything but light. Vance stared at Bennett, the faint smile on his lips disappearing. In its place was a more evaluative, sharper look. A few times, Vance repeated in a low voice. He tilted his head, as if weighing whether to continue speaking, but he did not speak right away. There was something in the way Bennett answered that made him realize this story might not be as simple as he had assumed. Harlan remained silent. He did not rush to ask more. He was accustomed to listening to the spaces between answers, where more truths were often hidden than in the words themselves. His gaze never left Bennett, as if waiting for something deeper. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy. The cameras continued recording, but the initial ease had vanished. The host at the far end looked toward Harlan, uneasy, unsure whether to continue with the script or wait. No one signaled. Everything paused there. In a moment where a short answer had opened far too many questions, Bennett clearly sensed the shift. He knew that from this point on, sitting quietly in the corner would no longer be an easy option. The attention had been drawn to him, and with it came looks mixed with curiosity, skepticism, and judgment. Harlan stepped closer by one pace. The distance between him and Bennett was now close enough for those around them to understand that the conversation had moved into a different phase. His voice lowered, slow and deliberate, carrying a seriousness Bennett had not heard before. "So what was your call sign?" The question was asked gently, but its weight spread throughout the room. In that moment, everything seemed to stop, and Bennett knew he was standing at the boundary between continuing to remain silent and letting the past step into the light. Harlan's question dropped into the room like a pebble thrown onto still water. The sound was not loud, but the ripples spread very quickly. Bennett felt it even before he had time to react. His breathing slowed, deeper. The hand resting on his thigh trembled slightly, a movement so small that only he himself noticed it. The silver coin in his palm shifted a little, then stopped completely. He raised his head. Bennett's gaze locked onto Harlan's, neither seeking permission nor avoiding it. In that moment, the room seemed to recede. The rows of seats, the faces, the cameras recording everything, all of it became a blurred backdrop. What stood out most clearly was memory, thick and heavy, reeking of metal and cold seawater. Harlan was still standing there, patient. He did not press him. He had asked the question, and he understood that some answers needed time to step out of the darkness. His eyes never left Bennett, firm, yet waiting. Bennett took another deep breath. When he spoke, his voice was neither loud nor trembling. Each word was placed exactly where it belonged, as if it had been weighed for a very long time. Shadow 1. The two words rang out, clear and without excess. They were not spoken as a boast, nor as a confession. They spoke of it as a simple fact, a name that had followed him for many years, even though no one ever called it. The laughter in the room vanished instantly. The low murmurs from before drained away as if sucked dry. A young officer in the front row let go of the pen he was holding. It hit the floor with a dry, sharp sound, louder than any words in that moment. Harlan froze. His hand was still clasping Bennett's from the earlier handshake, a gesture that by protocol should have lasted only a few seconds. But now, that hand did not let go. The muscles in his face tightened, his expression changing so quickly that even those standing nearby noticed. He said nothing, but his eyes were no longer those of an admiral attending a tribute ceremony. They were the eyes of a man who had just heard a name he never expected to surface in this room. Derek Vance reacted almost immediately. The color drained from his face. The faint smile he had worn earlier disappeared, replaced by a tension that was hard to hide. "That's impossible," Vance blurted out, his voice lower than usual, as if even he did not want the words to carry too far. He looked at Bennett, then at Harlan, then scanned the room, searching for some sign that this was merely a harmless coincidence. No one spoke. The veterans in the front remained silent. A few frowned, as if trying to dig through their memories for something they had once heard, once known. For many of them, The name that had just been spoken was unfamiliar, but Harlan's and Vance's reactions were enough for them to understand that this was not an ordinary code name. Bennett held his position. He did not offer any further explanation. He had answered the question, and for him, that was enough. His hand gradually relaxed, the silver coin once again lying still in his palm, cold and heavy. He could clearly feel his heartbeat, steady but deep, as if his body were preparing for something his mind had known all along. Harlan finally moved. He blinked, as if returning from a very distant place. He looked straight at Bennett, his gaze a mixture of shock and something difficult to name. What did he just say? An officer standing nearby whispered not to Bennett, but to Harlan, as if seeking confirmation. Harlan did not answer that question. He was still holding Bennett's hand. His grip unconsciously tightened slightly before he slowly let go. When he stepped back, half a step, the movement carried a rare sense of caution. He did not voice his thoughts, but those who had worked with him for many years could tell that the name just spoken had touched a layer of memory Harlan did not often reveal. Vance could no longer stand still. He stepped aside, slipped his hand into his jacket pocket, and pulled out his phone faster than necessary. His fingers moved across the screen, decisive yet lacking his earlier confidence. He lowered his head, the glow from the screen lighting up his tense face, exposing the rigid lines of his clenched jaw. "No way," Vance repeated, this time more quietly, as if reassuring himself. He accessed the internal system, and the data entries he believed to be absolutely accurate. To Vance, data was truth. If it was not in the system, it did not exist. He believed that as a rule of life. Meanwhile, the room remained submerged in silence. The cameras continued recording, but no one paid them any attention anymore. The host stood motionless in the distance, not daring to signal a cut or a continuation. The script had slipped from their grasp the moment those two words were spoken. An older veteran in the middle row leaned toward his comrade and whispered, "Did you hear that?" The other shook his head, his eyes still fixed on Bennett. Curiosity began to spread, slowly but steadily. Not everyone understood the meaning of that code name, but everyone could feel the weight it carried. Bennett sensed those looks. He neither avoided them nor responded. He had lived with this name in silence for far too long to feel the need to defend it now. He knew that from this moment on, silence had been broken, whether he wanted it or not. Harlan took a deep breath, as if rearranging his thoughts. He glanced at Vance, then back at Bennett. His voice dropped, even lower than when he had asked the initial question. "Are you sure?" The question carried no doubt, but rather a final confirmation. As if he were standing before a door he was unsure he should open. Bennett nodded a slow, decisive nod. He said nothing more. That simple but unmistakable gesture tightened the atmosphere in the room another notch. Vance suddenly looked up. The phone screen reflected in his eyes. Lines of data scrolled past rapidly, too fast for anyone else to read. He pressed his lips together, his jaw clenched tight. What he was seeing did not match what he believed to be the truth. He turned back, his expression tense. "Sir," Vance said, his voice no longer as steady as before. "I'm checking." The hand holding the phone trembled slightly. A small but unmistakable sign. The room held its breath. No one knew what would appear on that screen, but everyone understood that from the moment Bennett spoke that name, this tribute ceremony had entered a different phase, and whatever was about to be revealed would no longer fit within the bounds of a carefully staged ritual. The air in the room tightened with each passing second as Derek Vance lowered his head and stared intently at the phone screen. His fingers moved quickly and decisively, as if speed itself could force the data to produce the answer he wanted. The light from the screen reflected onto his clenched face, clearly revealing the frustration being held in check. Vance lifted his head. His voice dropped, hard and sharp. "There is no record of Harold Bennett." The statement rang out loud enough to cut through the silence in the room. He paused for a beat, as if weighing the gravity of what he was about to say next. "There is no Shadow One still alive." A few people shifted slightly. Some nodded reflexively, trusting what was familiar rather than what had just been spoken. Data, to them, was still the most reliable thing. Vance noticed the hesitation and seized it. He straightened up, his voice regaining some of its original confidence. "The system does not lie," he said, his eyes flicking quickly toward Harlan. "If it does not exist in the records, then it does not exist." Harlan did not respond immediately. He looked at Vance, then turned to Bennett. His gaze was different now from a few minutes earlier, less ceremonial, more contemplative. He said nothing, but it was clear he was waiting to see what Bennett would do next. Bennett remained seated. He did not argue, did not speak in his own defense. His hand, clenched tightly, since the moment the name was spoken, slowly opened. The movement was deliberate, as if he were measuring every millimeter of the surrounding space. His rough palm opened under the lights, revealing an old silver coin. The metal caught the light, not brightly, but enough to draw every eye in the room. The edge of the coin was worn, the surface lightly scratched, the marks of time clearly visible. It did not resemble the keepsakes typically seen at commemorative ceremonies. It carried something different, restrained and heavy, as if it itself had been to places this room could never reach. A wave of silence spread. Vance stared at the coin, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly, as though trying to find another sarcastic remark. But this time, the words did not come immediately. Something in Harlan's reaction made him hesitate. Harlan leaned forward. The movement surprised many in the room. He did not need to bend that low to see clearly, but he did so anyway. His eyes focused on the coin, his expression changing visibly. Those standing nearby noticed the shift even before he spoke. Harlan extended his hand, not touching it, stopping just short. He spoke slowly, each word clear. "This is not VA property." He looked up, meeting Vance's gaze directly. "This is an access code." The room seemed to grow colder. A few younger officers glanced at one another, not fully understanding the meaning of the statement, but enough to realize that what lay in Bennett's hand was not an anonymous object. Vance stepped back one pace, reacting faster than his own thoughts. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if what he was about to say had been swallowed back down by himself. "Sir," Vance said, his voice lower, tighter. "We cannot rely on an item with no publicly registered serial number." He tried to keep his tone rational, but the certainty had fractured. Anyone could fabricate it. Harlan did not turn to him right away. He continued to look at the coin in Bennett's hand, as if reading a language that only a very small number of people had ever been taught. "You are mistaken," Harlan replied, his voice even but firm. "Things like this do not exist to be made public." Bennett maintained his posture, his palm still open. He did not explain. He had presented the only thing he knew could speak on his behalf. There was no defiance in his eyes, nor any expectation. He had prepared himself for this moment long ago, long enough to understand that truth, when revealed, does not require a preface. A soft sound came from the back of the room. An older man stood up, slowly but decisively. Richard Cole, a former naval intelligence officer, who had remained silent until now. He stepped forward one pace, his voice low and steady, carrying the habit of someone accustomed to reports not meant for the public. "That coin appeared in the Operation Shadow report," Cole said. He paused briefly, allowing all eyes to turn toward him. "March of 1982. The room held its breath. Cole continued without looking at any papers. "The report concluded that a young SEAL was killed due to an incorrect guidance signal." The final words fell heavily. They were not spoken to assign blame, but they were anything but gentle. Vance spun toward Cole. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice urgent, as if searching for a crack to cling to. "Those reports were sealed." Cole nodded. "I read them." He looked at Bennett, then turned to Harlan. "And I never forgot that coin." Silence enveloped the room. Those who had just witnessed a public denial now stood in the middle of a far more complex truth. A legend had just been named, and at the same time, the death of a young soldier had been dragged into the light. Harlan straightened, his eyes swept across the room, registering every face struggling to process what they had just heard. He did not speak immediately. He knew that this moment no longer belonged to protocol, nor to authority. It belonged to a truth slowly emerging, rough and uncomfortable. Vance stood still, his hand gripping his phone tightly. What he had believed to be solid ground was shifting beneath him. He looked at Bennett, this time without his earlier contempt, replaced instead by a wariness mixed with confusion. He realized that this story could not be extinguished by a single empty line of data. "Do you think this is the evidence of a hero, or the beginning of a crime concealed for many years? Comment and follow, because the truth that has just been opened will be more ruthless than what this room is ready to face." No one said another word. The room was frozen. The name that had been buried for decades had been spoken, and with it came the bloodstain of a story that had never been fully told. Richard Cole's words still hung in the air, heavy like an object that had not yet fallen. "Final report conclusion. One young SEAL killed in action." He spoke slowly, his tone even, carrying no excess emotion, as if reciting a line already carved deep into memory. The room froze for a brief beat, then began to stir, whispers colliding with one another, low but insistent. All eyes turned toward Harold Bennett. His position, once obscured in the corner of the room, had now become the center. Faces that moments earlier had held an air of reverence began to shift, curiosity mixed with doubt. The name Shadow 1 had brought with it a death, and that death created an uneasy void that everyone could feel. Derek Vance did not miss the moment. He stepped forward half a pace, just enough to place himself within the camera's frame. His voice was sharp and cold, clean as a freshly honed blade. "You see, Sir," Vance said, turning toward Harlan, then immediately back to Bennett. The way he moved made it clear this was not an impulsive reaction, but a calculated choice. Vance looked straight at Bennett, his gaze unflinching. "One man died. You are still alive." The words were delivered slowly, each one separated, as if he wanted to be certain that everyone in the room heard them clearly. A few sharp intakes of breath followed. Someone frowned slightly. Someone else nodded almost imperceptibly, reacting to an argument that sounded, on the surface, reasonable. Vance did not stop. The corner of his mouth lifted, not into a smile, but into the self-satisfaction of someone who believed he had landed the decisive blow. "What kind of legend lets a teammate die?" he asked, without waiting for an answer. The question did not require one because its purpose was to frame Bennett as the survivor who carried another man's death with him. Bennett lowered his head. The movement was slow, not an act of evasion, but a familiar reflex in response to judgments that had followed him for years. The silver coin in his hand no longer turned. It rested still in his palm, heavier than it had been moments before. He did not look up. He did not argue. His silence, in the eyes of those watching, was easily mistaken for an admission. The whispers began to spread. A young officer leaned toward a colleague, his voice very low, yet close enough for those nearby to hear. Maybe he was just lucky. The remark passed quickly, but left behind an uncomfortable aftertaste. Several gazes shifted, no longer fixed solely on Bennett, but searching for a reaction from Harlan. The atmosphere of reverence constructed at the beginning of the ceremony began to fracture. The formal greetings, the dignified handshakes, now felt as though they belonged to another room, another time. This room now carried the tension of an unspoken interrogation, where the past was dragged out of the shadows to serve hurried conclusions. Harlan stood still, his eyes moving across the wavering faces. He looked at Vance, then at Bennett. He understood what Vance was doing. This was not about finding truth, but about seizing control of the narrative. Vance was using death to redefine a man in the way most convenient to his argument. "Major," Harlan said, his voice low, but Vance cut in before he could finish. "Sir," Vance replied, quick and decisive. "We are talking about accountability." He turned to the room, as if seeking support. "A young soldier died, and we have just heard that the guide is still here." Vance spread his hand slightly, an open gesture that carried an imposing edge. "If we call that a hero, then our standards have a problem." A few people nodded, not many, but enough to create the sense that Vance's argument was finding footing. Others remained silent, not necessarily in agreement, but because they did not yet know where to stand in this moment. Bennett kept his head bowed. He heard everything. Each sentence was like a pebble thrown into a lake of memories already full of ripples. He remembered the name being mentioned, remembered the young face, remembered a voice still unaccustomed to the prolonged silence of underwater missions, but he did not speak. He had learned to keep those things to himself, cause each time they were spoken aloud, they were never heard in the way he hoped. Richard Cole remained where he was, offering no further intervention. He had said what needed to be said for now. He knew that the rest of the story, if told, would not be easy and might not be welcomed. His gaze passed over Bennett with a quiet acknowledgement, then settled on Harlan. Vance sensed the hesitation in the room and pressed harder. "We cannot let emotion cloud the facts," he said. "The report is clear. One SEAL was killed in action, and Shadow 1, he emphasized the call sign, survived." He tilted his head, his eyes sharp. History should be written correctly. The statement startled a few people. Rewriting history sounded noble in theory, but in this context, it carried the taste of hasty judgment. Vance was not speaking of the whole truth, only the portion of truth that supported his conclusion. Harlan drew a deep breath. He could feel the shift in the air, the slide from honor into suspicion. He knew that if he did not intervene, the story would be shaped in the direction Vance wanted. Quickly, and with little chance of reversal, Vance turned toward Harlan, his voice firm, as though placing a final period on his argument. "Perhaps we are honoring the wrong man." The words rang out clearly, their intent undisguised. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a fractured silence. Eyes moved back and forth between Bennett and Harlan, waiting for what would come next. In that moment, the fate of a legend, or of a man burdened with guilt, seemed to hang suspended, dependent on what would be said next. Vance's words still lingered in the air as he straightened his posture, folding his arms across his chest and fully occupying the space before the cameras. The lights shone directly onto his face, accentuating the cold confidence of someone who believed he was in control of the narrative. The seconds of silence that followed did not unsettle him. On the contrary, they created the perfect pause for him to continue. Sealed records exist to hide accountability, Vance said, his voice steady and loud enough for the entire room to hear. He did not direct the statement at any specific individual, but released it into the space like a prearranged conclusion. A few people shifted slightly, their eyes wavering between Bennett and Harlan. The way Vance spoke made everything sound reasonable, as if the system's silence could only be explained by some guilt that needed to be concealed. Vance took another step forward, his arm extending, his index finger pointing straight at the silver coin still resting in Bennett's palm. "Souvenirs don't wash away blood," he said, without raising his voice. The sentence landed cleanly and sharply. A few young officers followed the gesture, then looked toward Bennett, their expressions no longer maintaining their initial neutrality. One young officer nodded in agreement, the movement very slight, but not unnoticed by those around him. That momentary concurrence was enough for Vance to realize he was heading in the right direction. He took a deep breath, as if savoring the moment when his argument began to take root. "History has no place for the nameless," Vance said more loudly, his voice ringing clearly under the lights. He turned slightly, addressing the entire room now, no longer speaking solely to Harlan or Bennett. "We honor those who leave a mark, not empty names in a file." Those words generated a quiet wave of reaction. Some people nodded, others frowned, sensing that something was wrong but not yet certain enough to object. Vance's confidence, combined with his reliance on data and records, made it easier for many to stand with him, rather than with a silent old man in the corner of the room. Bennett closed his eyes. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if to block the images crowding into his mind. His hand tightened, the silver coin pressed against his skin, cold and hard. He heard every word, every inflection in Vance's voice, and he knew that if he continued to remain silent, that silence would be used to reinforce conclusions he had never chosen. Harlan frowned. He looked at Vance, then at Bennett. He sensed the fragile boundary Vance was crossing, yet he still did not speak, not because he agreed, but because he understood that any interruption at this moment could be interpreted as bias. He was waiting, not for data, but for the response of the only person who could alter the direction of the story. Vance did not give Bennett that space. He pressed on, his voice concise and unwavering. "You lived, others died. It's that simple." The statement was delivered like a calculation requiring no further explanation. It stripped away every other factor, every complex context, leaving only the outcome Vance wanted to emphasize. A wave of silence spread, but this time it carried no trace of reverence. Eyes that had once regarded Bennett with curiosity or neutrality began to shift toward suspicion. Some people tilted their heads, others released faint sighs, as if accepting a grim but reasonable conclusion. The change was subtle, but Bennett felt it clearly. Richard Cole stood motionless at the back, saying nothing. He looked at Vance, then at Bennett, his expression darkening. He knew Vance was using part of the truth to obscure the rest, but he also knew that if he spoke now, his words would be dismissed as a belated defense. The cameras continued rolling. The lights did not change. Visually, everything still maintained the polished appearance of an official ceremony. But beneath the surface, the story had completely shifted. Those present began to forget that this had ever been a tribute. It was becoming an unofficial trial, where the defendant's silence was treated as a confession. Vance scanned the room, recognizing the change in people's eyes. He lowered his voice slightly, adopting a more measured tone. "We can't let emotion cloud accountability," he said. "If we call every survivor a hero, then what meaning does the death of others hold?" Bennett kept his eyes closed. In that moment, he vividly remembered the face of the young soldier from that year, remembered the still immature voice, remembered the trusting eyes when the order was given. Those memories needed no words to exist, yet they had never been allowed into the light. He had carried them alone for far too long, long enough to know that silence could also become a form of complicity, even if he had never intended it to be. Harlan clenched his jaw. He could clearly see the shift within the room, the way Vance's words were gradually shaping a collective conclusion. He knew that if Bennett did not speak, the story would end here, with a legend dismantled and replaced by the image of a survivor burdened with the deaths of others. A few people began whispering among themselves, voices low but sufficient to form an uneasy background murmur. Words like accountability, concealment, and luck surfaced in fragments. No one finished a full sentence, but everyone understood what the others meant. Bennett opened his eyes. It was a small movement, but enough for Harlan to notice immediately. Bennett's gaze was no longer lowered, nor did it avert itself. He looked straight ahead, not seeking sympathy, nor avoiding the doubtful stares converging on him. His hand still gripped the coin, but his posture had changed. Steadier, more grounded. The room dipped into a brief pause. Vance noticed the shift, but did not react in time. For the first time since this story began, Bennett was preparing to break the silence that had both protected and imprisoned him for decades. And as he drew in a deep breath, every eye turned toward him, waiting for what would be spoken next. Bennett opened his eyes fully, his gaze directed straight ahead. The room, previously noisy with whispers, suddenly fell silent, as if every sound were waiting for the next words. He did not look at Vance, nor did he turn to Harlan to seek permission. He simply stood still in that moment, inhaled slowly, then spoke, soft enough to carry no tone of defiance, yet clear enough that no one could ignore it. His name was Michael Reyes. The sentence was simple, without introduction, without explanation, yet it made the room hold its breath. A few people instinctively tilted their heads, as if the name that had just been spoken carried a weight far greater than its sound. Michael Reyes was no longer a line in a report, no longer a statistical figure. That name had just been returned to a human being, 23 years old. Bennett continued, his voice low and even. First mission. Those brief details fell slowly. They did not need emphasis, because everyone in the room understood their meaning. 23. The first time. Words that carried an entire world not yet fully lived. A few veterans lowered their heads ever so slightly, a familiar reflex in the face of memories that never fade. Bennett lifted his head, his eyes no longer aimed at the floor, nor did they avoid the gazes now focused on him. I was the guide, he said clearly, not avoiding his role in the story. The sentence was like placing a heavy stone upon his own chest, yet his voice remained steady, unshaken. Vance curled his lip. The fleeting smile carried no joy, only the cold satisfaction of someone who had just heard what he had been waiting for. And you were wrong, he said, his tone concise and final, as if completing a proof. The words did not need to be loud because the room was listening to every syllable. Bennett nodded. The movement was slow and deliberate. Yes, just one word, no more, no less. He did not try to explain immediately, nor did he attempt to place his answer into a broader context. He accepted it first, as an undeniable foundation. He paused briefly, then continued, I live with it every day. His voice grew slightly hoarse, not from a sudden surge of emotion, but from long years carrying the same memory. The sentence was not spoken to seek sympathy. It was spoken as a truth that had become part of everyday life. No one laughed anymore. The mocking smiles, the self-satisfied looks, had disappeared. The room was now facing a story that was no longer easy to judge. A few people turned to look at Vance, waiting for him to continue, but Vance remained silent for a moment, as if weighing his next step. Harlan stood still, his eyes never leaving Bennett. He had heard many confessions in his life, but rarely one spoken with such heavy calm. There was no sign of seeking forgiveness, nor any attempt to evade responsibility, only the act of naming the truth most directly. Richard Cole inhaled slowly, then exhaled. He looked at Bennett, his gaze growing heavier. Cole understood well what it meant for someone to choose to speak like this, in front of cameras, in front of eyes, ready to judge. This was not a way to protect oneself, but a way to accept a burden that had long become familiar. Vance broke the silence. That is enough, he said, his voice low but firm. You admit the mistake. One man is dead. What more do we need? He spread his hand slightly, as if inviting the room to arrive at a simple conclusion together. Bennett did not respond immediately. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the space before him. Old images surfaced clearly, not in sequence, but in sensation. The smell of metal, the sound of water, the prolonged silence. He had grown accustomed to living with those fragments of memory, but this was the first time he allowed them to step outside. He trusted me, Bennett said, his voice lower. The sentence was not on the list of things he had planned to say, yet it emerged, nonetheless, as naturally as breath. I told him to go first, and he went. A few people inhaled softly. Those words carried a painful intimacy, a bond that numbers and reports could never convey. Vance did not interrupt this time. He looked at Bennett, his gaze less sharp, though not yet softened. We are talking about responsibility, Vance said, striving to keep his voice steady, not emotion. Bennett nodded very slightly. I know, he replied, without argument. I have never forgotten that. He paused, the hand resting on his thigh tightening gently, the silver coin pressing into into his skin, but if we stop there, then he will only be a line of text. The room fell silent again. Those listening began to realize that this story was no longer moving toward a simple verdict. Bennett was not fleeing from his mistake, but he also refused to let it be the entirety of the truth. Vance looked toward Harlan, as if searching for a sign of intervention. Harlan remained silent. He understood that this was a moment when his authority needed to step back, making room for the story to be told in full. Bennett took a deep breath. This breath was longer than the previous ones, as if he were preparing to open a door that had been locked for far too long. His gaze did not waver. But that night, he said, his voice low and slow, there was more than one truth. The sentence stopped there, hanging in the air. The expressions in the room shifted instantly. Suspicion turned into curiosity, tension into anticipation. Vance frowned slightly, sensing that the story had just taken a different direction, one he no longer fully controlled. If you carried a mistake for an entire lifetime, would you run from it or face it? Comment and follow to hear the truth to the very end. Bennett's words still hung in the air as he paused after a long breath. No one in the room interrupted. Even Derek Vance remained silent in that rare moment, as if he understood that any interruption now could push the story beyond his control. Bennett looked down slightly, then raised his head. His voice was low and slow, no longer carrying the rhythm of a dialogue in the present room, but sounding as though he were carefully opening a memory that had been locked away for far too long. The signal was distorted, he said clearly, not minor interference. Everything on the screen was off standard. A few veterans subtly shifted their posture. Those who had experienced war understood that signal distortion was not a small technical detail. It was the line between control and chaos. Bennett continued without needing to be prompted. I had two choices. He paused for a beat, as if looking back at his former self from many years earlier, standing between two paths that both led to consequences. I could keep the old signal and accept the risk, he went on, or I could switch to a new sonar, something that had never been tested under those conditions. His hand tightened slightly on his thigh, the silver coin pressing into his skin. I chose the new sonar. His voice carried no pride, nor did it try to make the decision sound more reasonable. He simply recounted it as a fact that had occurred. In the room, the silence thickened. Every eye was fixed on him, waiting for what would come next. Vance cut in, his voice sharp and quick, like a blade drawn at precisely the right moment, and he died. The sentence was brief, requiring no further explanation. It put a full stop on the chain of cause and effect in the simplest possible way. Bennett did not look away. He met Vance's gaze directly, his eyes calm, but not weak. He trusted me, Bennett replied, neither raising his voice nor arguing. He followed the signal I sent. That statement caused the air in the room to sag. A few people inhaled quietly. This was no longer a story about data or reports, but about trust between people operating in the dark, where every decision was made under conditions no one else could fully understand. Bennett continued, his tone steadier now, as if he had passed the hardest point. After that, they called me in. He did not specify who they were, but no one in the room needed to ask. They said that if the truth came out, the shadow program would collapse. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the listening faces. They said that death would lead to many other deaths. A few young officers frowned. Richard Cole exhaled softly, as if these words confirmed something he had known for a long time. Vance stood straighter, his eyes wavering for a moment before quickly returning to their original hardness. That's why the file was sealed, Vance said, his voice lower. To protect the program. Bennett nodded very slightly. Yes, he said, and to protect the people who made the decisions. His hand clenched tighter, his knuckles turning white. I was ordered to remain silent. The words were not spoken as an accusation, but as a bare fact. Silence was not his choice. It was the condition required for everything to continue operating, as it always had. In that moment, some people in the room began to understand that Bennett's many years of silence were not avoidance, but the result of an agreement he had no power to refuse. The atmosphere grew heavy. Each sentence seemed to add another layer of lead to the room. The lights, once soft, now appeared to shine lower, highlighting the tension on every face. The cameras were still running, but no one was thinking about being recorded anymore. Harlan stood still, his hands held in front of him, his eyes never leaving Bennett. He had heard enough to understand that this story could not be closed with a simple conclusion. What Bennett had just revealed did not erase the death of Michael Reyes, but it placed that death within a broader context, where responsibility no longer belonged to a single person. Vance looked around, realizing that his argument was beginning to lose its initial certainty. He tried to keep his tone rational. You were still the one who made the decision, he said. He died because of that decision. Correct, Bennett replied immediately, without hesitation. I have never denied that. He looked straight at Vance. But he did not die because of negligence. The sentence was delivered slowly, each word clear. He died on a mission where the truth was not allowed to exist. Silence fell once more. A few veterans lowered their heads. The younger people began to realize that they were hearing a part of history that had never been told at formal ceremonies or in training manuals. Richard Cole stepped half a pace forward, then stopped. He did not speak, but his gaze turned toward Harlan like an unspoken signal. Harlan noticed it. He turned to Cole, the seriousness evident on his face. Have you read the appendix? Harlan asked, his voice low and firm. The question rang out, cutting through the heavy silence. It was not directed at Bennett, nor at Vance. It was aimed at the remaining part of the truth, the part that had not yet been placed on the table, and in that moment, all eyes shifted to Richard Cole, waiting for what would be revealed next. Harlan's question hung in the middle of the room, unanswered for the moment. Richard Cole stood still at the end of the row of seats, his gaze neither evasive nor hurried. He had waited for this moment for a very long time, long enough to understand that once the truth was opened, it could never be put back where it had been. Harlan walked toward the table set against the wall, where several folders were arranged neatly, according to protocol. He opened one discolored binder, his movements slow, as if fully aware of what he was about to read. The sound of old paper rubbing together carried clearly through the otherwise silent room. Those standing nearby followed every motion, sensing the gravity in the way he handled the documents. Harlan flipped to a page buried deep inside. He paused, scanned it, then drew in a breath. When he spoke, his voice rang out clearly, no longer carrying the rhythm of a ceremonial event. Shadow 1 opened the safe corridor. He read slowly, each word distinct, as if repositioning them within history. A cold wave spread through the room. Those who had heard the name Shadow 1 surrounded by speculation now faced a concrete description stripped of myth, reduced to action. Harlan continued, without looking up, sacrifice the ability to withdraw. His voice dropped as he read that line, and he himself paused for a brief beat long enough for the room to grasp the meaning of the words just spoken. The room went dead silent, no whispers, no small movements. The younger attendees glanced at one another, trying to imagine what that meant in real terms. For the older veterans, there was no need to imagine. They knew exactly. Sacrificing the ability to withdraw was not an abstract concept. It meant choosing to remain in the danger zone so that others could escape. Harlan turned the page. Reyes volunteered to stay behind to provide cover. He read on, his voice no louder, but clearer. The name Michael Reyes appeared again, this time not as the victim of a mistake, but as someone who had made his own choice. Derek Vance stepped back one pace. The color drained from his face so quickly that it was obvious even without bright lights. His eyes were fixed on the folder in Harlan's hands, as if still searching for some crack, some detail that might allow denial. But the lines being read left very little room for favorable interpretation. Bennett lowered his head. The motion did not collapse, but rather resembled a long-held breath finally being released. His eyes closed for a brief moment. No tears fell, but they reddened slightly, a sign of emotion restrained for many years. Harlan closed the folder. His hand trembled faintly, enough for him alone to notice. When he lifted his head, his gaze was no longer that of an admiral, standing on a ceremonial platform. It was the gaze of someone who had just finished reading a truth he could no longer stand apart from. This report, Harlan said, his voice rougher than before, is an appendix. He looked around the room, as if making sure everyone understood. It was not included in the official version. A few people drew quiet breaths. An appendix. The word alone explained why this truth had never appeared in the publicly told stories. It existed, but it had been placed where only very specific individuals were permitted to read it. Richard Cole nodded almost imperceptibly. It was buried, he said in a low voice. Like many other things, Vance stood motionless, his arms hanging at his sides. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The sharp arguments he had wielded earlier no longer had a place. The data he trusted absolutely had just expanded, and within that expansion, his conclusions no longer held firm. Harlan turned to Bennett. In that moment, two men occupying very different positions within the system stood facing each other, sharing a truth that had just been named. Bennett's head was still lowered, but his posture no longer resembled that of a man under interrogation. He looked like someone who had been waiting for this moment, even if he had never been sure it would come. You stayed behind, Harlan said, not reading from the page, but speaking directly to Bennett. You opened the way for them. Bennett did not reply. He gave a very slight nod, almost imperceptible. To him, these things had never been secret. They had simply never been allowed to exist outside the memories of those who were there that night. The room remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, no longer accusatory, nor filled with doubt. It was like the moment when a group of people realizes that the story they have long believed has been missing a crucial part. Harlan took a deep breath. He glanced once more at the folder in his hand, then set it down on the table. When he spoke again, his voice trembled not from fear, but because emotion had finally broken through the familiar layer of discipline. In that team, he said, pausing for a very brief beat, was my father. The sentence landed quietly, but with enough force to leave everyone stunned. Eyes immediately turned toward Harlan, carrying undisguised surprise. This was the first time he had placed himself inside the story not as an admiral, but as a son. Harlan did not continue at once. He lowered his head for a moment, as if sorting through his own memories. He used to say, Harlan went on, his voice catching, that if not for the one who stood in the shadows and opened the way, they would not have made it back. Bennett lifted his head. His eyes met Harlan's. In that moment, two people from different generations understood that they were standing on the same straight line of history, separated only by stories that had never been told. No one in the room moved. The cameras were still recording, but no one remembered their presence anymore. Everyone understood that they had just witnessed something that could not be taken back, a truth that had stepped out of the appendix and into the center of the room. Harlan straightened. He looked around the room, his gaze pausing briefly on Vance, then returning to Bennett. We have been silent for too long, he said, and the price of that silence is that we allowed the story to be distorted. He said nothing more. He did not need to. The statement about his father had already done enough. It not only restored Bennett's place, but also reset the focus of the entire story, not about legend, nor about guilt, but about those who stood in the shadows, so that others could step into the light. No one knew how to react in that moment, but everyone understood that from here on, the history of that night was no longer something that could ever be buried again. The room maintained its stillness after Harlan's words about his father. The lights did not change. The cameras kept rolling, but everything inside had shifted. Faces that had once been tense now carried a belated understanding. History had just been placed back in its proper position, and no one could pretend they had not heard it. Harlan stepped toward Harold Bennett. He stopped for a beat, looking straight at the man who had remained in the shadows for far too long. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he dropped down onto one knee. The movement was decisive, without hesitation, without preface. The only sound was the faint brush of fabric against the floor, but it was enough to freeze the entire room. You saved the whole team, Harlan said, his voice low and clear. He was not speaking for the cameras, nor for his subordinates. He was speaking to Bennett, as a final acknowledgement that should have come many years earlier. Harlan lifted his head, his eyes faintly reddened. My father once told me, he continued, his voice catching for a brief moment, if you ever meet the man who stood in the darkness and opened the way that night, bow your head before him. The words were spoken slowly, as if each one had been held in his chest for far too long. No one in the room moved. There was no applause, no murmuring. The cameras continued to record, but no one dared signal a cut. This moment went beyond any script. It did not need editing to become more beautiful, because the truth within it already carried enough weight. Derek Vance stood motionless. His arms hung loosely at his sides. The sharp arguments from earlier had nowhere left to cling. His gaze lingered on Bennett, then shifted to Harlan. For the first time that afternoon, he said nothing. The arrogance that had once allowed him to dominate the room now became an empty shell, no longer able to conceal the confusion inside. Harlan stood up. He turned to those present, his voice returning to the calm of a leader, but with a different tone. The name Harold Bennett will be formally restored to the honor records, he said, in full, not to rewrite history, but to return history to where it truly belongs. An officer standing nearby nodded and quickly took notes. There was no elaborate ceremony, no long speech. The decision was delivered cleanly, as if it had been waiting for a very long time, needing only a single moment to be spoken aloud. A small box was brought forward. The metal inside was not the kind usually seen at formal ceremonies. It was not tied to a specific victory, nor accompanied by loud praise. Harlan accepted it, and then handed it to Bennett with both hands. No announcer was introducing the moment. No background music. Only a solemn silence filled the room. Bennett looked down at the metal in his hands. He did not tremble. He did not cry. He gave a very slight nod, a gesture that closed a chapter of life that had lasted far too long. The burden he had carried for decades seemed to fall away in that instant, without noise, without drama, but enough for him to feel relief. For the first time in many decades, Richard Cole stood at the back, his eyes following the scene. He did not smile, nor did he show excessive emotion. He simply exhaled slowly, as if he could finally release a portion of the responsibility he had silently carried alongside Bennett. Harlan turned back toward the cameras, then to those present. "We are used to telling neat stories," he said, "but real history is rarely neat. It is shaped by difficult choices, by people who stand in the darkness so others can step into the light." No one objected. No one tried to revise those words. The younger people in the room stood still, listening, realizing that the ceremony they thought they understood had become a lesson no textbook could ever fully teach. Vance looked down at the floor for a moment, then lifted his head. He did not apologize, nor did he justify himself. His eyes were no longer cold, but carried a belated awareness. He understood that he had just witnessed something that would still be spoken of many years from now, not because it was beautiful, but because it was right. Bennett lifted his gaze around the room. The looks he received now were completely different from those at the start of the afternoon. There was no pity, no doubt, only quiet respect, late, but sincere. He did not say another word. He had said enough. The last sunlight outside the glass windows gradually faded. The room sank into a softer light, as if time itself slowed to remember this moment. The cameras kept running until the final second, but no one cared anymore how the footage would be broadcast. Who do you think truly deserves to be called a hero? Leave a comment and follow the channel, because there are truths that, no matter how long they are buried, will eventually find their way into the light. When the sunlight finally disappeared beyond the window, the room understood something it should have understood much earlier. History had just been called by its proper name, and for Harold Bennett, that recognition came too late to return the years that had been lost. But it was enough to close the life of a man who had stood in the darkness, quietly doing what needed to be done, and then waiting for the moment when truth was forced to bow before itself. The story ended there, not with applause or familiar cheers, but with a silence long enough to make people question what they had just witnessed. Some truths are buried for so long that when they are finally named, they are no longer loud. They simply stand there, forcing everyone to look directly at them. And some people do not need early recognition. They only need history not to forget them forever. If this story made you pause, even for just a few seconds, if you have ever seen someone judged simply because they were silent, stay with us. Follow and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next stories, where truth is not told to be beautiful, but told to be right. Because every time you choose to listen all the way through, you help forgotten truths gain one more chance to step into the light.